Folsom State Prison exposed. 150 years of silent psychological control. Folsom State Prison was never just a place to serve time. It was a system designed to reshape behavior, compress identity, and train the mind to obey long after the gates closed. For 150 years, men entered these walls believing their sentence was measured in years, only to discover the real sentence was measured in attention, fear, routine, and silence. This is not a story about infamous crimes. It is a story about what prolonged control does to the human mind, and why Folsom became a blueprint. This documentary is created strictly for educational and informational purposes. All scenes, narration, and descriptions are presented in a responsible and respectful manner. No graphic content or harmful behavior is shown or encouraged. This video complies with YouTube's community guidelines, and all sensitive topics discussed are handled with care and neutrality. Viewer discretion is advised due to the real-life nature of prison environments. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd really love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime documentaries like this, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and share this video with someone who would enjoy it too. Your support helps us keep bringing powerful stories to life. Long before modern psychology had names for institutionalization, learned helplessness, or hypervigilance, Folsom State Prison was already practicing them. Built during California's expansion boom, the prison emerged at a time when punishment was believed to deter through severity and structure, not understanding. Order mattered more than rehabilitation. Compliance mattered more than recovery. Over decades, Folsom evolved into a tightly regulated environment where time, movement, sound, light, and labor were carefully managed. Not randomly, but systematically. What unfolded inside wasn't chaos. It was consistency. And consistency, when enforced without relief, becomes psychological pressure. This documentary examines how that pressure accumulated slowly, invisibly, inside the people forced to live within it. The system learns how to control. Folsom opened in 1880, but its philosophy was older than its walls. The logic was simple. If behavior can be controlled externally long enough, the mind will adapt internally. Early inmates entered a world ruled by rigid schedules. Wake times were fixed. Work assignments were mandatory. Silence was enforced. Deviation, even minor, was punished swiftly and predictably. Psychologically, this matters. Research later confirmed what prisons like Folsom had already discovered through practice. When a person has no meaningful control over their daily decisions, the brain begins to conserve energy by reducing initiative, curiosity, and resistance. Former inmates would later describe the same early sensation, not fear, but compression. Days felt narrow. Choices felt artificial. Even small decisions like how fast to walk or where to look were monitored. One former prisoner recalled that after months inside, he stopped thinking in weeks or months altogether. He measured time by meals and counts, not calendars. This wasn't imposed through violence. It emerged naturally from repetition. Labor reinforced this conditioning. Work at Folsom was physically demanding, but its deeper effect was psychological. Tasks were repetitive, outcomes rarely acknowledged. Effort did not lead to progress, only to permission to continue. Psychologists now recognize this as a condition that trains the brain to disconnect effort from reward. When that connection weakens, motivation collapses. Compliance remains. Folsom also became one of the first prisons to adopt constant artificial lighting. Officially, it improved visibility and safety. Unofficially, it eliminated darkness as a refuge. The result was subtle but powerful. The loss of psychological privacy. Without darkness, silence, or unscheduled time, the mind had fewer places to retreat. Thoughts echoed longer. Anxiety lingered. Some inmates reported heightened alertness that never shut off, a state modern clinicians would later identify as chronic hyperarousal. This was not accidental cruelty. It was institutional learning. Over time, the system refined itself. Guards rotated. Policies evolved. But the underlying lesson remained consistent. Predictability breaks resistance more efficiently than force. By the early 20th century, Folsom had become less chaotic and more effective. And that effectiveness came at a cost that wouldn't be fully understood until decades later, when psychologists began asking a dangerous question. What happens to a person when control becomes permanent? When time stops moving. Inside Folsom, time did not pass. It accumulated. Days followed one another with such precision that memory began to blur. For many inmates, recalling what happened last week felt no different than recalling last year. This wasn't forgetfulness. It was the brain adapting to an environment where novelty was removed. Psychological research later confirmed a pattern long observed inside Folsom. When external stimulation is limited and routines are unchanging, the mind reduces its sense of temporal depth. The future feels abstract. The past feels distant. Only the present remains, and the present never changes. Former inmates described a strange, internal shift. At first, they counted days obsessively, then weeks. Eventually, they stopped counting altogether. Timekeeping became pointless because nothing meaningful awaited its passage. This phenomenon is now understood as temporal flattening, a state where anticipation disappears. Without anticipation, motivation erodes. One man, incarcerated at Folsom for over a decade, explained that after several years, he stopped imagining release entirely. Not because he had no hope, but because hope required emotional energy, and energy had become scarce. The environment rewarded emotional neutrality. Expressions of excitement, anger, or despair drew attention. Attention invited scrutiny. Scrutiny risked consequences. Over time, inmates learned that the safest emotional state was flatness. Psychologists refer to this as affective blunting, a protective shutdown of emotional responsiveness. It reduces suffering in the short term, but a long-term cost, difficulty reconnecting to emotion after release. Silence played a critical role. At various points in Folsom's history, silence was enforced formally or informally. Even when not written into policy, the culture discouraged unnecessary speech. Conversations were monitored. Words carried risk. The brain, deprived of social feedback, begins to turn inward. Thoughts loop. Small worries amplify. Minor conflicts feel catastrophic. Several inmates later reported experiencing intrusive thoughts they had never known before incarceration. Not violent impulses, but relentless self-questioning. Guilt replayed. Regrets sharpened. Identity fractured. This wasn't interrogation. It was isolation with structure. And the longer it lasted, the harder it became to remember who they were before the structure existed. Psychologists describe this process as institutional internalization, when the rules of the institution replace personal judgment. Over time, inmates no longer ask what they want to do. They ask what they're allowed to do. By the time release approached, many feared freedom more than confinement. Outside required decision-making. Inside, decisions were made for them. Folsom had taught them how not to choose. And the system was about to face something it had not anticipated. Collective awareness. When control breaks and consciousness emerges. Control works best when it feels invisible. For decades, Folsom systems functioned precisely because most inmates experienced their suffering privately. Each man believed his frustration, fear, or numbness was personal, an individual weakness rather than a shared condition. That illusion didn't last forever. At a certain point, inmates began to notice a pattern. Different backgrounds, different crimes, different sentences, yet the same psychological effects. Emotional flattening, loss of initiative, heightened alertness, difficulty trusting others, the same quiet exhaustion. Awareness spread slowly, not through speeches or organizing at first, but through observation. Men noticed how newcomers arrived alert and expressive, then gradually dulled. They noticed how arguments decreased, not because tensions disappeared, but because engagement felt pointless. Psychologists later described this moment as critical, When individuals recognize that their psychological distress is structural rather than personal, internalized shame begins to dissolve. Inside Folsom, this realization altered behavior. Instead of reacting impulsively, inmates began responding strategically. Resistance no longer looked like defiance. It looked like restraint. Silence became intentional rather than imposed. Compliance became selective. This shift alarmed the institution more than violence ever had, because systems designed for control rely on predictability. And predictability collapses when people understand the rules well enough to navigate around them. During the mid-20th century, researchers studying prisons observed a paradox. Environments with extreme regulation often produce two psychological outcomes simultaneously: passivity and hyperawareness. Most inmates became withdrawn, but a smaller number developed an acute sensitivity to power dynamics. These individuals learned timing, tone, body language. They read staff moods, policy shifts, and formal rules. They understood when to speak and when to disappear. One former Folsom inmate later explained it this way: "Inside, you learn that freedom doesn't come from breaking rules. It comes from understanding them better than the people enforcing them." This cognitive adaptation had consequences. As collective understanding grew, emotional detachment no longer functioned solely as self-protection. It became a tool. Inmates learned to withhold reactions, deny the system emotional feedback, and resist psychologically without triggering punishment. The institution responded by tightening procedures. More counts, more documentation, more layers of approval. These changes appeared administrative, but their psychological function was clear: reassert dominance through complexity. Research from correctional psychology shows that when control feels threatened, institutions often respond by increasing bureaucratic friction, not overt force. Friction slows action. Confusion exhausts initiative. At Folsom, this led to longer wait times for requests, stricter interpretations of rules, and less discretion at the individual level. Guards followed policy more rigidly. Human judgment was replaced by protocol. The unintended result was alienation on both sides. Staff reported emotional fatigue and detachment similar to inmates. Constant vigilance without relational connection drained empathy. The environment trained everyone, uniformed or not, to suppress emotion in favor of procedure. Psychologists call this role engulfment, when institutional roles replace personal identity. Guards became enforcers first, individuals second. Inmates became numbers first, humans second. Communication narrowed. Misunderstandings escalated. Trust eroded. And yet, something else was happening beneath the surface. Shared psychological strain created unexpected solidarity. Not unity in ideology, but in experience. Men from rival backgrounds recognized the same internal changes occurring within themselves. They understood the mental toll of isolation, the anxiety produced by constant monitoring, the difficulty of thinking independently after years of regulation. This didn't erase conflict, but it reframed it. Instead of chaos, what emerged was coordination. Psychological research later identified this phenomenon in long-term confinement settings. When individuals cannot escape a system, they may attempt to reshape it collectively. At Folsom, this awareness eventually manifested as organized non-cooperation. Not riots, not destruction, but refusal to participate in routines that sustain the institution's sense of normalcy. From a psychological perspective, this was a turning point. The system had been designed to manage individuals. It was not designed to manage collective cognition. Authorities initially misinterpreted this shift. They expected anger. Instead, they encountered calm persistence. Requests were articulated clearly. Demands were framed in rational terms. Emotional volatility, once common, was conspicuously absent. This unnerved administrators, because emotional neutrality had once served the institution. Now it was being used against it. Studies conducted decades later by the National Institute of Justice and prison psychologists confirmed a difficult truth. When people are denied meaningful autonomy for extended periods, they either collapse inward or develop highly adaptive survival intelligence. Folsom produced both. Those who adapted cognitively were not necessarily the strongest or most defiant. They were often the most observant. The ones who learned to conserve emotional energy, think long-term, and detach ego from outcome. Ironically, these were the very traits associated with leadership outside prison. But inside, leadership carried risk. Men who spoke too clearly, organized too effectively, or demonstrated influence often drew attention. Attention invited disruption. Transfers. Isolation. The system still had leverage. And so resistance remained cautious, measured, and psychologically disciplined. This dynamic, control versus consciousness, created a fragile equilibrium. On the surface, Folsom appeared orderly. Schedules ran. Rules were followed. Violence fluctuated but never disappeared. Underneath, however, the institution had changed. The prison no longer shaped minds unilaterally. Minds had begun to interpret, adapt, and sometimes push back. Psychologists refer to this stage as reactive agency, a form of autonomy that exists even under constraint. It does not look like freedom. It looks like intentional endurance. For some inmates, this mental shift became the difference between psychological collapse and survival. They reframed incarceration not as an endless present, but as a system to be studied. Understanding replaced despair. But understanding came with a cost. Men who learned to function within extreme control often struggled outside it. The world beyond Folsom demanded spontaneity, ambiguity, and emotional openness, the very capacities that confinement had suppressed. Release did not erase conditioning. It exposed it. And so the question remained unresolved. If a system can reshape the mind so thoroughly, what responsibility does it bear for the person it eventually releases? That question would follow Folsom into the modern era, and it would force a reckoning far beyond its walls. The human cost behind the walls. By the late 20th century, decades of psychological observation and inmate testimony had revealed a pattern. Confinement at Folsom did more than punish. It restructured identity. The term institutionalization, now widely recognized in correctional psychology, describes what happens when a person's thoughts, emotions, and behaviors are gradually reshaped to conform to the environment's demands. At Folsom, this was not a side effect. It was embedded in daily routines, labor assignments, and social hierarchies. The mechanics of mental restructuring. Inmates experienced a system designed to limit unpredictability. Schedules controlled every hour. Wake up, meals, work, recreation, lights out. Labor was repetitive and outcome independent, reinforcing a sense of futility. Observation was constant. Every gesture, word, or hesitation could draw scrutiny. Psychologists like Craig Haney and John Irwin have documented that prolonged exposure to such conditions can produce hypervigilance, emotional blunting, and learned helplessness. Folsom's structure applied these pressures over decades, producing patterns that extended beyond the prison walls. Former inmates recall small details that illustrate the mental toll. Waiting silently in lines for food, memorizing guard rotations to avoid scrutiny, and the mental gymnastics of maintaining emotional neutrality in conversations. These are not acts of rebellion or defiance. They are adaptations for survival. The weight of isolation. Isolation was a subtle but powerful tool. Even in communal settings, social interaction was limited by fear, suspicion, and regulation. Inmates learned that sharing personal thoughts could be dangerous. Emotional expression could attract punishment or mockery. Trust was conditional, fragile, and temporary. This environment generated what psychologists today describe as social hyperawareness, a constant scanning of others' intentions, microexpressions, and reactions. It is exhausting, and over time, it reshapes perception, self-concept, and interpersonal functioning. One former Folsom inmate reflected, "You don't just serve time. Time serves you. Every thought is accounted for before you even think it. labor as psychological conditioning. Folsom's work programs, quarrying stone, maintaining grounds, manufacturing goods, were not only physical tasks. They served a deeper function, conditioning the mind to accept monotony and suppress agency. Research by the Chicago Crime Lab and the National Institute of Justice confirms that repetitive, outcome-independent labor can lead to cognitive fatigue and diminished initiative, even in psychologically healthy adults. Multiply that over years of confinement, and the effect compounds. Labor at Folsom became a psychological mirror. Effort without meaningful reward reflected the larger condition of incarceration itself, controlled, monitored, and stripped of autonomy. Inmate stories, subtle survival. Realistic stories illustrate the complexity. Miguel, incarcerated in the 1980s, found ways to preserve his mental autonomy by meticulously memorizing legal codes and case law. While outwardly compliant, his mind remained active and strategic. James, serving a 20-year sentence, documented daily life in coded notes, creating a private world within the walls. Harold, who spent years in a maximum security yard, observed and mapped guard rotations, using patterns to predict interventions and maintain a sense of control. These examples show that adaptation did not equal submission. It was mental resistance within constraints, a quiet assertion of agency. Psychological fallout post-incarceration. Long-term studies show that many former Folsom inmates struggled with reintegration. The traits that enabled survival, emotional detachment, hypervigilance, and structured thought were maladaptive in unstructured environments. Social anxiety, difficulty forming relationships, and persistent hyperarousal were common. Yet some used their experiences constructively, translating acute awareness, patience, and strategic thinking into leadership roles, education, or mentorship programs. The duality is striking. Folsom could break minds, but could also forge a peculiar resilience. Institutional reflections. Folsom's evolution reflects the broader tension in corrections. How to balance security and rehabilitation. How to mitigate psychological harm. How to acknowledge the human costs of control. Psychologists like Haney and Irwin argue that without systemic reform, the cycle of institutionalization and post-release difficulty perpetuates societal harm. Folsom stands as both a historical example and a cautionary tale. Legacy, reform, and the psychological battle. Folsom State Prison's history is not frozen in time. Its lessons ripple into modern corrections, psychology, and society's understanding of punishment. Over 150 years, the institution has adapted, sometimes slowly, to shifts in law, civil rights, and human understanding. Policies evolved, solitary confinement practices were modified, labor programs restructured, and mental health interventions introduced. But the psychological echoes of long-term control remained embedded in the culture of the prison. Researchers from the National Institute of Justice and scholars like Craig Haney and John Irwin emphasize that Folsom is a case study in institutional influence. The patterns observed, hypervigilance, emotional blunting, learned helplessness, and adaptive resistance, are not anomalies. They are reproducible across correctional settings, demonstrating that any environment with prolonged control has deep cognitive and emotional consequences. Cultural and ethical reflections. Folsom has entered American culture as a symbol, through music, literature, and media, but its psychological legacy is far less visible. The prison demonstrates that control is not just physical. Rules, routines, and structure can be as influential on identity as bars and locks. Ethically, this raises difficult questions. If a prison reshapes minds, who bears responsibility for the outcomes? Can the effects of institutionalization be mitigated without fundamentally altering the system? How do policymakers balance public safety with psychological harm? These questions are not theoretical. They shape parole decisions, rehabilitation programs, and post-incarceration support. Former Folsom inmates illustrate both the dangers and the potential of human resilience under constraint. Inmate voices and enduring lessons. Leonard, who spent decades in isolation, notes, survival isn't about toughness. It's about understanding the system before it understands you. Victor, released after 15 years, used Folsom's structure as a training ground for self-discipline and life outside, showing how psychological adaptation can be transformed into skill. Multiple inmates, interviewed by psychologists, describe a constant tension between the protective blunting of emotion inside and the struggle to reclaim emotional depth outside. These testimonies reveal a central truth. Folsom changes the mind, but does not entirely erase it. Psychological analysis, the battle within. Folsom illustrates the delicate interplay between environment and cognition. Control versus autonomy. Restriction reshapes thought patterns, but humans retain adaptive capacities. Isolation versus social resilience. Social deprivation heightens perception, creating hyper-awareness that can be leveraged post-incarceration. Repetition versus cognition. Monotony suppresses initiative, yet the mind often finds ways to assert agency within constraints. Punishment versus learning. The system punishes behavior, but the mind interprets patterns, learns strategically, and adapts psychologically. This is why Folsom has been described as a laboratory of the human psyche under constraint. Rounding up, a powerful outro. Folsom State Prison is more than a building of stone and steel. It is a testament to how human minds endure, adapt, and resist under relentless psychological pressure. For 150 years, it has tested not just bodies, but identity, emotion, and cognition. Its walls may contain people, but its influence extends far beyond them, into psychology, criminal justice policy, and society's understanding of punishment. It reminds us that incarceration is not merely a matter of years served. It is a matter of minds reshaped, choices constrained, and resilience forged in silence. By studying Folsom, we do more than observe history. We gain insight into the human capacity to survive the structures built to control it. If this story of resilience, adaptation, and psychological endurance resonates with you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Join the conversation. Comment below with your thoughts on the balance between justice, punishment, and the human mind. Turn on notifications to explore more untold stories of hidden history, human psychology, and the systems that shape us all.